Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello friends, in this lecture, in fact this is a two-part lecture. Here, building upon our previous engagement with historiographical interventions from the decade of 1970s onwards, we will be dealing with recent interventions in history writing. By recent, I refer to period going back to mid 1980s onwards, and we would also like to refer to a frame questions which are often labeled as post-colonial historiography. If you recall, in our very first lecture, when I was introducing this series of lectures on historiography, I had suggested that post-colonial, the term, is used in two ways. One, to refer to a period after the empire ended in 1947 in Indian context. So, post-colonial in that sense is the period of post-independence. In another sense, and which is more crucial in terms of epistemic interventions in the field of history writing, post-colonial refers to a critical engagement with colonial heritage, colonial practices of writing history, colonial frames of approaching past, and there post-colonial attacks the very foundation of coming together of knowledge and power. History as a discipline, we know, particularly the modern history, emerged in a context, in a time frame which is also roughly correspond to the time of British Empire. Hence, there is an intertwining of colonial power structure shaping not merely the endeavors of anthropology, but also the practice of history. While looking at 19th and 20th century Indian historiography, we have tried to talk about this equation between colonialism and nationalist discourse of history. Sometimes what overtly looked like anti-colonial perspectives in history was in fact deeply embedded in positivist frame and desire for objective truth, which then went back to the history of this discipline, which was quite centrally rooted in European conventions, European scientific conventions, which came in a particular historical juncture, primarily in post-Enlightenment period. Now, in that equation, the task for scholars who may be termed as post-colonial in terms of their approach was how to recover and then analyze subjectivities which are rooted in colonial experiences, subjectivities which are in turn shaped by cultural specificities of colonial societies, and these subjectivities, they have argued, have either been ignored or in the frame of rational science, that is history, there is very little or perhaps no space left for addressing these subjectivities. For many of these subjectivities and its facets actually go beyond the frames of science itself, and it is extremely difficult to clearly delineate these contours of such subjectivities, such experiential dynamics. So, naturally, they point towards the limitation of the language of science, which history as a modern discipline inherits. So, with these concerns, post-colonial scholarship or history enters into different facets of events and processes which challenge our understanding of writing history, both at the level of our approach and method, as well as in terms of sources for writing, recovering, analyzing the politics of this knowledge field called history. So, hence the core question which has grappled the minds of this scholarship was how to write a history of subjectivities. In many cases, this question of how to articulate, how to bring these subjectivities in history has been much more important than defining what these subjectivities are. So, this how we need to keep in our mind, and it is this emphasis on how that has also taken scholarship away from causal understanding of past, which was once upon a time quite in vogue in the practice of history. So, for example, to put it very simply, many of these subjectivities, these experiential dynamics, for example, belief practices, cannot be answered in the framework of asking why. We can't reason out why do people believe what they believe, why do people worship, why do people have faith in certain aspects. However, it is possible to bring questions of faith, questions of belief, questions which broadly take us into realm of subjectivities by putting them in context. This is what we historians do, and then analyzing the relevance of such occurrences, such narratives of subjectivities in shaping the wider contours of time and society. So, how it becomes extremely significant, and then the question was not merely about recovery. Obviously, how to recover such experiences and engage with them has been central question, but the attempt has been to go beyond the task of recovery. And as I mentioned earlier, and I would like to repeat again, the issue is how to decode the politics. Else, mere recovery would lead to either subscribing Orientalist frame, where it is easily alleged that this is a kind of creating binary between East and West, and secondly, recovery may also be perceived as a revivalist trend endeavor in writing history. Post-colonial historiography is aware of these two dangers. This is not to say that they are not examples which fall in this epistemic danger, but we need to remain alert while engaging with questions of subjectivities. As I was mentioning, the question of how to recover these experiences within domain of history is extremely challenging, because history, which speaks the language of science, which is based on certain rational framework, and which continues to distinguish itself from fiction, continues to harp upon the verifiability of truth. In that context, how to engage with this question of subjectivities? Let us go and unpack this conundrum gradually, one by one. Post-colonial scholarship, by critiquing upon the equation between power and knowledge, colonial structures and development of disciplines, have particularly the development of science itself have engaged with the coming up of categories itself. Scholars have pointed towards the fact that what we tend to assume as universal categories, universal concepts, are actually coming from very specific historical trajectories, which again go back to post-Enlightenment Europe. In this context, I would like to mention the contribution of Deepesh Chakrabarty. His book is titled Provincializing Europe. The core question he engages with is how to write a history which is both a critique of the discipline and its assumptions without rejecting the discipline itself, without going outside the discipline. So, on the one hand, the Eurocentric history of discipline is inevitable. That is a given fact. but in that given scenario, the task of a historian is how to sensitize that history itself, that discipline, through the subjectivities of colonial society. And this is a much complex argument which Deepesh puts forward, and what I am offering is a very simplified understanding of it for the sake of our lecture. And here, when he is making appeal to sensitize history through experiences of colonies, we are entering into a kind of dialectic, which come into being by the historical trajectory of the discipline of history itself. So, the question is not merely how to critique this historical trajectory of the discipline, but how to offer a way ahead. How to address this dialectic in rigorous, creative, as well as critical fashion, so that the discipline can progress. The challenge in this regard are twofold. One, when we talk about the recovery of this subjectivity, the first challenge that we face is pertaining to the limitation of colonial archive. So, the fundamental question is pertaining to the archive itself, limitations of archive. One dimension of this limitation, this challenge, is how to read colonial archive against the grain. And I am using this phrase against the grain. We will come to this. The second challenge is how to move outside colonial archive without losing contact with this colonial archive. And let us pay some attention to these two challenges. First, how to read colonial archive against the grain. The term against the grain historians use, borrowing insights from, among others, Walter Benjamin, and it is a kind of methodological trope to read absences, to read files, arguments in search of not what has been stated in those files and such written documents, but in search of what has been deliberately hidden. So, it is a kind of reading to unpack the politics, the authority which go in the making of any government documents. Colonial Archive has been central to the task of modern history writing, but the obvious limitation of this archive is that it comes into being at the moment when subject population is identified and comes under the purview of colonial administrative machinery. So, the people enter into archive, into archival files only as a subject citizen of colonial state. So, the colonial state's inscription is already embedded when an individual figures in any archival document. There is no escape. However, we can creatively interpret such invisible colonial inscriptions while reading archival documents, and such creative exercises, this I deliberately call creative exercise because certain amount of imagination and inferences are required in decoding these texts. And these decoding exercises then can flip the power dynamics in favor of colonial subjectivities. So, that is one kind of exercise which historians undertake, reading what has not been written. Here it may be interesting to briefly ponder over how an individual enters into an archival file. I must make it clear here that when I am saying that an individual enters into archive, I do not mean individual as researcher who goes to access these archival files. What I mean is how Indian society comes to be reflected in these archival documents, how members of this society comes into being as figures in these files. And it is in this context, it is quite ironical that most of the time a person becomes a figure in the file only at the point of some crisis. For example, for any woman who entered into courtroom were referred with prefix masomat. Masomat, a term, literally means a widow. Why does state pre-conceptualizes its own subject position entering into courtroom as a widow? It is a question worth pondering, isn't it? However, this was just an example and we need not stop there and deliberate on this, as we have to cover a long distance. The point is how to read colonial documents and authorities embedded into it. The second part is moving outside the colonial archive. The question before we move outside the colonial archive naturally comes into mind is the need, what is the need for moving outside colonial archive? And instead of answering this question directly, let me take you to three arenas of historical scholarship which forced scholars to move outside colonial archive. And these three arenas are related to partition of Indian subcontinent, history of this partition past, then history of women, and history of caste atrocities, particularly history of segment of society which is scheduled caste, and we will take these three one by one to fathom out the reasons, the need to move outside colonial archive. We will start with historical scholarship on the partition of Indian subcontinent. It was a massive colossal event which led to the disruption of life of more than 6 million people. There is no authentic estimate available. In some cases, people have argued that the number even goes up to 20 million. And for very long time, unfortunately, partition was never part of Indian partition was for very long time was ignored by Indian historians. This was either written as a story of conspiracy theory, taking place at high level of political maneuvering, or it remained another chapter in the transfer of power from colonial state to India and Pakistan, a part of decolonization history, a part of the process of decolonization in history, going back to the Second World War periods. So, in between conspiracy theory, negotiation for power and transfer of power, the pain, the suffering, the violence which subcontinent witnessed at that point of time remained ignored in historical scholarship, in historical accounts. The question is how to write a history of pain and suffering which people faced. For the first time, the challenge, the realization of this part of history came to surface once again ironically at the moment of another crisis in the days following anti-Sikh riots of mid-80s. It was in the aftermath of this violence when professors, intellectuals, civil society members went on went to the streets and started sympathizing, talking to victims of anti-Sikh riots. The victims often referred back to their partisan traumas. Some said this is another partisan. Some even went on to say this was worse than partisan. We had already suffered during the partisan. They lament why we have to suffer once again. Such traumatic narratives then forced these intellectuals, academicians, civil society members to ponder over whether we, the community of historians, have paid enough attention to the wounds, to the trauma, to the victimhood which came into being at the moment of India getting independence and simultaneously when India was also partitioned into two, India and Pakistan. It is not that outside history, for example, literature was oblivious to this trauma. We did have wonderful accounts of partition. However, history as a discipline had not paid attention to this aspect. Here, when I am referring to history, we have here when I am referring to literature on partition, novels like Tamas or Mohan Rakesh's Jhootha Sach or account written by Anis Kidwai, Azadi Ki Chhaav Mein, writings by some of the best storytellers this subcontinent has produced, be it Ismat Chughtai or Saadat Hasan Manto. We have a vast corpus available, yet we never cared to have conversation with this corpus standing from the disciplinary location of history. The question was how to engage with this trauma. Does history allow us, or does it have resources to engage with such traumatic events beyond merely producing the political accounts of boardroom meetings and decisions taken at high political arenas. And here scholars took the route of oral history, began collecting oral narratives, biographies and case studies of victims and witnesses, started making a new kind of archive. This was an archive in making, which was far away from what we have conventionally been accustomed to looking at the state archive. For example, and another important aspect worth mentioning at this point is this engagement with partition also forced the discipline of history to lose its rigidity, disciplinary and methodological rigidity, to shed its own inhibitions and to embrace positive vistas opened up by its neighboring disciplines such as literature, psychology, anthropology, and memory studies. Though memory studies even today is not a recognized and practicing discipline within India, but these accounts have challenged or forced history to engage with memories of past, memories which are by default, which are by their very nature quite fluid. The questions posed were, should we use these oral narratives, the domain of memory, merely as resource for writing history, or should we engage with these narratives, these memories also as analytical fields and not merely as location for reconstructing history. Gyanendra Pandey's works are quite illuminating in this regard. In the neighborhood, in literature, Urvashi Butalia came up with other side of silence, in anthropology, works of Beena Das are particularly noteworthy, and outside disciplinary framework we have contributions by Professor Ashish Nandi, who have argued that partition of subcontinent made it possible for long ambiguous journeys for many families who had so far no experience of even the harsh urban life. Rural folk were forced to migrate to urban landscapes, and that had in turn various ramifications, both positive and negative. So, it is a complicated history in many ways. In many of these accounts, the core anxiety of discipline of history came quite palpable. Whether what has been told is factually correct or not, what other resources do we have to cross verify these narratives, the quantum of violence narrated, how to authenticate such individual trauma. Then we had unique cases, for example, honor killings, how to understand such exceptional behaviors. The questions are endless. The only possible reference point to engage with partisan violence, and which has often been referred, was studies dealing with the experiences of concentration camp. Auschwitz was one such concentration camp in Germany, when Hitler was annihilating Jewish population and putting them in gas chamber. But unlike Germany, in Indian context, this was an enmity between communities, where old childhood friends turned into enemy. people with whom, families with whom foods and happy and sad moments were shared, became marauders, and the extreme brutality which women folk from both the communities faced. The scholarship on partition for very long time, and this began from the second half of 1980s, but for very long time the historical scholarship on partition remained Punjab centric. Where the cases of physical violence were extreme in terms of numbers, in terms of brutality. However, across the subcontinent the experience of partition was not the same. While the narratives coming from Punjab are wrapped in excessive violence, in case of narratives coming from people of Sindhi community who migrated from Pakistan to India, it is the loss of land which is quite agonizing. Similarly, in the case of partition between India and East Pakistan, which later came to be known as Bangladesh, there emerged range of other cultural complications, and the divide between the partition migrants and the natives have continued over several generations. Along with oral narratives, historians turned their gaze towards literature. Writings of Manto, Ismat Chugtai, Bhism Sani, and wonderful possibilities emerged, where once again literature was engaged not to seek information, but to recover images and subjectivities of this trauma. We will continue with this thread and how history engaged with literature even outside partition narratives in our second part of this lecture. Thank you.